Drugs are the main source of income for illegal crime groups. It's what keeps people involved with crime, and it's what pulls people into the process of becoming criminal. There are social problems. The process of prohibiting drugs is engaging of our vulnerable youth. I'm a social worker. And one of the things that I'm acutely aware of is our society's cohesiveness. The bonds between all of us add up to a healthy society. The process of drug prohibition reduces our social cohesiveness. It marginalizes, fractures, and targets our most vulnerable people. The people who we need to be engaging in our society in many different ways, we're attacking through our drug laws. And that's a problem for our whole social structure. But the process of social policy, I would call it deadly social policy, that targets and marginalizes people is something that we cannot step away from in Canada. I'm a drug educator. I am aware, having done drug education for 20 years now, that drug educators, people like me, have historically lied about drugs. And that's a problem. We can't lie about drugs anymore. We have to tell the truth. If we do not tell the truth about marijuana to youth, they will not believe us when we talk about crack cocaine. And we need the youth of our society to trust us. We used to have as our objective to scare people, and that's how we justified lying. It doesn't work. There are economic problems with drug prohibition. There are the huge wasted resources, tracking them down, arresting them, imprisoning them, judging them, preventing drugs from coming across our border costs us a huge amount of money, and we waste it. We also fail to collect significant tax revenues. Stephen Easton, who's a Simon Fraser economist, wrote a report saying that the marijuana industry in this province is our largest industry. That is an amazing statement. And that is an untaxed criminal industry. How large is the illegal market? Well, the global illegal market is estimated between 450 and 750 billion. In Canada, it's estimated between 7 and 18 billion. And one report estimated that the global black market was up to $1 trillion. That money is a problem for all of us. And the reason why it's a problem is it floats around behind the scenes in the illegal markets. If you're a drug dealer, you cannot take a duffel bag full of cash and dump it on a realtor's desk and buy a house. You have to launder it. What does laundering mean? Laundering means you start a bunch of businesses, usually cash-based businesses on the ground. Things like restaurants and bars and vending machine companies. Those are owned by holding companies, and those holding companies are owned by other holding companies that are sold all the time back and forth on the stock market. The Economist observed that you cannot see the truth when you're looking at an economic spreadsheet because that huge amount of illegal money is floating around behind the scenes, destabilizing world markets. It's also destabilizing of governments. What we have in many third world countries is an unholy marriage between smugglers, drug smugglers, who want protection and have money, and guerrilla armies who have guns, the willingness to kill, and want money. And these two forces join in society, and what we get is this. We have drug armies running around in places like Afghanistan, in countries like Colombia. And these fragile countries are completely torn apart by the damage that that does to them. The Economist asked a very simple question. Is this really any way to win the drugs war? And they called it a muddle in the jungle. There are significant harms from this process. Do we have to tolerate these harms because it is so enormously effective at protecting us from the hazards of chemicals in our society? We would know that drug prohibition was working because it would decrease the availability of drugs. It would increase the price of drugs, it would prevent the use of drugs, and it would deter people from entering the drug trade. So let's look at the question, does drug prohibition decrease the availability of drugs? One of the truths in Vancouver is you can get drugs delivered to your door faster than you can get a pizza. They have to cook the pizza. All high schools have drugs in them. In fact, they're primary retail distribution points for drugs in our society. It's very disturbing to me that teens report that drugs are easier to obtain than alcohol or tobacco. Teens do not ask each other for age ID when they sell to each other. All jails have drugs in them. If these tools of drug prohibition do not work when we have men locked in cages, how can these tools work on the streets? When you look at the availability of cannabis, about 90%, the red line on this graph, 90% of grade 12 students report that cannabis is either very easy or fairly easy to obtain. Of all students, this is US data, half students of all the students in the United States report that crack cocaine is fairly easy or very easy to obtain. Does prohibition increase drug prices? Because in theory, the more money that we spent on the war on drugs, the more expensive drugs would become. What we've seen is exactly the opposite. This chart shows two lines. The increasing green line is increasing spending on the war on drugs. The red line is cannabis use rates. What we see is they are not particularly connected. But money on the drug war started escalating in the early 1980s. So it's absolutely fascinating to me that if you look at the pure price of heroin per pure gram, slowly since the 1980s, the price per pure gram has dropped. And that's across North America. Just heroin? Well, let's look at crystal meth. Slowly over the years, crystal meth becomes cheaper. Just heroin and crystal meth? No, the same applies to cocaine. If drug prohibition worked, what we would see is the country which has most criminalized drugs would have very low use rates in terms of the percentage of students who report ever having tried an illegal drug in their lives. So the country that has most criminalized drugs also has one of the highest per capita usage rates. That's a clue that it's not working. Very simply put, what drives the whole thing is the fact that you can grow gold in your basement. If you look at the price per pure gram of cannabis and the price per pure gram of gold, they're not that different. And heroin and cocaine are worth a whole lot more. If we took the money out of the equation for the organized crime groups, the incentive to do the crimes would go away. Yes, there would always be crime in our society, but the drivers that increase it could be greatly reduced.